So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to modify what I said on Tuesday, and I'm going to be talking about the analytic-synthetic doctrine, which is a way of looking at the analytic-synthetic distinction. So I'll get to the doctrine in a minute. First I want to recap the analytic-synthetic distinction. There are analytic statements which Hume called relations of ideas. And it's important to remember Hume's name for this because analytic claims, analytic truths, and analytic falsities are claims about relationships between concepts, the implications and exclusions of and contradictions of concepts. It's conceptual reasoning. It's conceptual reasoning. And examples, an example of a true analytic proposition: no bachelors are married. That is an analytic truth. It's something that can't be false, and it's true because of the meanings of the terms involved. And here's a false analytic proposition: a square circle exists. It's false because of the meanings of the concepts involved. Doesn't tell us whether married people exist or not. Doesn't tell us whether bachelors exist or not. Doesn't tell us if any square objects are out there or not, or any circles are out there or not. It just sets up sort of a rule for the concepts we use. And if we have a definition of a square, nothing that fits that definition will fit our definition of a circle. So this really isn't about real life. Now, on the other side, we have synthetic reasoning, or synthetic propositions. Let's say synthetic propositions, which are propositions what Hume called matters of fact. But by which he means matters of physical fact, or matters of existent fact. The things that exist or don't exist. If you came in late, see me after to make sure I mark you present. Right? So these things are about reality. It is evidence-based reasoning, evidential reasoning. So I want to ask a question. Mathematics. Is mathematics analytic or synthetic? Is mathematics about conceptual rules and fitting definitions? Or is it about going out into the world? Let me put it this way. Can you be a mathematician without ever leaving the house, or without ever leaving, can you be a mathematician in Starbucks and never do any math outside? Sure you can. You can just sit down with paper or a computer and stuff like that. What about archaeology? Can you do archaeology in your living room? I mean, you might do some stuff in your living room, but can you do archaeology without ever, or paleontology? They just discovered a new tyrannosaur. It was dead. This is no, unfortunately, but it was the oldest tyrannosaur fossil they'd ever known. They pushed back the tyrannosaurs by like 1 million years or something, right? So can you do paleontology without ever going outside of your living room? And the answer is no. You've got to go and look at stuff. So an example of analytic reasoning is math. An example of synthetic reasoning is paleontology. Now, in science you use analytic and deductive arguments and statements and things like that. It's sort of a mix. But the key is here, this is evidence-based. Evidence is necessary. Observation-based. You have to make observations, whereas this is concept-based, definition-based. Now, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of logic. Anyone taken a logic class? If you take a logic class, at some point they're supposed to tell you that there are two kinds of logic. And one of the ways of expressing the difference between these two kinds of logic is to say that deductive logic basically deals with analytic propositions. Whereas something called inductive logic, which is the logic of what is and isn't true in the real world, sometimes called informal logic, formal logic, informal logic. So, oh, I didn't give examples. An example of a synthetic truth. Oops. Oh, I'll start with the false side. Right. It says Pomona, the city that hosts this university, is in the continent of Africa. Right. And a synthetic truth. Africa is a continent. Which means that the object we call Africa is a large land mass that is big enough that it falls into the class of land masses that we call continents. And how do you tell if Africa is a continent? You don't look at the definition of a continent and another definition of Africa, because how do you define Africa? Well, we don't define Africa. We denote it. We point it out. We get out a map or something, or a globe, and we say, look, this mass here, this mass of land, we call this Africa. So, oh, that's pretty good, big. It's a big island. Well, it's too big to be just an island. We call it a continent. Actually, it's not an island because it's connected to other continents. There's an isthmus between them. So, it's a big mass of land that we designate by this name Africa, and it's big enough that we call it one of the continents. Does that make sense? And we know, how do we know this is false? Well, it's because Nairobi is still a hell of a long way away. We go out, we don't see giraffes and zebras wandering around. Whatever features Africa has that distinguish it from Southern California, we don't find here. I mean, and maybe, you know, if I asked you to prove that Pomona is not in Africa, you might have a little trouble getting started, but eventually, you could bring out a map or a, Google Maps or a satellite image. But it would be based on evidence. And our ideas of the size of Africa are based on evidence. People have sailed around it and they say, oh, wow, it just keeps going. So these are the two kinds of concepts. Everyone's clear on that, right? There's these two kinds of concepts. Now I'm going to talk about what might be called the analytic synthetic doctrine. I mentioned it before. I mentioned it on Tuesday. I just didn't call it a doctrine, but I want to call it a doctrine. And I'm going to call it the A/S doctrine. And when I say something's a doctrine, it's like it's a proposition, it's a statement, it's a claim. It's something that someone says is true. When I talk about the distinction, I'm just saying, hey, we can make this distinction, but maybe it doesn't reflect the world. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Right? You can distinguish between various different kinds of cars, but do you care? Do we care? The doctrine says, somebody cares, and the doctrine says someone's making a truth claim, making a claim about the world, a claim about reality. Actually, I'll start it out differently. No proposition is ever both analytic and synthetic. No proposition is ever both. So there's no such thing, and according to this doctrine, there is no such thing as a proposition that is both analytic and synthetic. But absolutely all meaningful propositions are either analytic or synthetic. So I'm calling this the AS doctrine, or the analytic synthetic doctrine. And the reason why it's a doctrine rather than a distinction is because it takes this distinction and says that it covers everything. It says that there are no propositions that are on both sides of the line, and every proposition is in one side of the line. If you want, I could draw a Venn diagram. Class of propositions, meaningful statements that express propositions, that express claims about reality, claims about what is and is not true, truth-valued claims. We say we can draw a line down the middle of this, and it's analytic and synthetic. Every proposition ever goes into this big circle, and they go into one side or the other, and these do not overlap. There's just a dividing line between them. See me after about attendance. So that's the analytic synthetic doctrine. Okay, so everyone I went over this on Tuesday, so everybody's got this down cold, right? Right. So, now, there's a number of issues that come up with this. Normally I'd give the argument for the doctrine, but I'm going to actually save that until later, because it's actually, it ties into a major criticism of the doctrine. So I'm going to talk about 4 topics. First, there's the attack on some rationalist arguments. The analytic synthetic doctrine can be used to make an attack on some rationalist arguments. But I'm also going to argue that it also can be used as an attack on rationalism as an attack on rationalism itself. And I'm going to argue, I'm going to claim anyway, I'm going to claim that it works as an attack on rationalist arguments, on some rationalist arguments. There are some arguments given by rationalists that completely fail when you look at them from the point of view of the doctrine. That if the doctrine's true, there's a whole class of arguments that are just no good and cannot ever work, that are just logically bad. But I'm not saying that the doctrine by itself knocks down rationalism. I think rationalism is dead. I think rationalism should be dead. I think rationalism is only of historical importance, that it's interesting to study, but it's not going to give us anything useful. Right? Rationalism has had its chance and it failed. I believe that. But I don't believe that the analytic synthetic doctrine by itself knocks down rationalism. It might show some weakness in it, but it doesn't knock down rationalism. And I'll try to explain that as I go along. Then I'm going to talk about 2 objections to the analytic synthetic doctrine. There's the causality. Oops. The causality objection, which is an objection that Hume himself came up with, that says this doctrine, the distinction here, this doctrine cannot handle the idea of causality. And it's actually a brilliant criticism, and it tells us, analyzing it tells us stuff about causality that we may not have realized before. Then there's also what I call the category objection. Category objection takes the doctrine, right, and it recognizes the fact that the doctrine is a claim about reality. It's a proposition. It's something that could be true or false. And the doctrine asserts that every proposition is either analytic or synthetic. There are no propositions that are both analytic and synthetic, and there are no propositions that are neither analytic nor synthetic. So what kind of proposition is the doctrine itself? Is the analytic synthetic doctrine an analytic statement? Is it a synthetic statement? And so later on, pretty much the last thing we'll do is we'll look at the category objection and try to figure out what kind of statement the doctrine is. And if it turns out the doctrine is both analytic and synthetic, Hume's argument fails. And if it turns out the doctrine is neither analytic nor synthetic, Hume's argument fails because he claims that this is an exhaustive and absolute distinction. Every proposition is either analytic or synthetic. It falls in one and exactly one of those categories. So if the claim that the distinction, if that claim itself doesn't fall into one of these categories, he's got to be wrong. It's a self-contradiction. All right. So, any questions before I go on? Okay. All right. Well, here's the easy bit first, the attack on some rationalist arguments. And I emphasize some. Sometimes people make claims about the world based entirely on reasoning about concepts. If you remember René Descartes' argument for Cartesian argument for dualism, for mental dualism, the idea that the mind is a separate substance from the body, that mind is immaterial where body is material, that mind and body have no properties in common, that was an entirely conceptual argument. And the way to see this is to contrast it with the way empiricists reason about the mind. Go and look at how scientists think about the mind, how they investigate the existence and nature of mental phenomena. Have you ever had someone get really angry when you criticize them? Because that's a phenomenon, right? People get defensive. And when someone's challenged, sometimes when people are challenged, they get angry, they say stupid stuff, and then they smirk at you like, haha, I told you. And that's actually been studied. A guy called Douglas Weston took people who react like that. These are people with strong political partisanship. People, I think it was back when Romney was still a viable candidate. So he took people who were die-hard Romney supporters and people who were die-hard Obama supporters and pointed out inconvenient facts about the candidates. And they found that the certain people, like if I'm an Obama supporter and you criticize Obama, I'll get mad at you, I'll say something weird that seems to support my position but isn't really true. And then I'll be like, yeah, I just told you. And how did Weston investigate this? Well, he didn't sit down and think of the concept of a president or the concept of criticism or the concept of anger. He didn't think about concepts at all. What he did was he put people's heads into an fMRI machine and saw what was going on in their brains when they were angry, when they were criticized. Right? And what happened was that the limbic system was very active, the aggression, arousal system was very active, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your head that handles rational thought, was stone cold. It was not active. Nothing was happening in the thinking bit of the brain. So that's how an empiricist investigates mental phenomenon. You describe a mental phenomenon and then you try and see what's going on in the brain when that mental thing is going on. Did Descartes look at anybody's brain? Did he look at anything physical at all? Did he look at anything at all? Descartes made an argument that could be given, could be developed, could be worked out completely in full, sitting in a corner table at Starbucks. You need a nice cup of little macchiato, sit down, pen and paper, work it all out. Didn't even interview anyone. There are no interviews. There's no photographs, there's no x-rays, there's no fMRI, which they didn't have or anything, right? No weighing brain matter or looking for activity. It was just, what's your idea about the brain, the mind? What's your concept of the mind? What's your concept of the body? How are they related? Oh my God, they're not related. So the ontological things, the existing things that those concepts are attached to, must be just like the concepts and have nothing to do with each other. Well, that's this classic conceptual argument, and it's an argument for a claim about the world that mind exists as an immaterial substance that is completely separate and detachable from body, based entirely about reasoning about concepts. But the doctrine says you can't support a synthetic proposition, which is a proposition about things that exist, things that are real, based on purely analytic reasoning. This is one of the major consequences of the doctrine. If I'm going to support a synthetic proposition, I have to have at least some synthetic reasoning. I had to do what Locke did. I had to use Occam's razor. And fundamentally, there has to be evidence involved in the argument somewhere. There has to be something that can be observed. And if you remember Berkeley, it means there has to be sense data. There has to be sense data. We have to sense something. There has to be something we sense that's right there with us, right before us, that we are aware of to base the argument. And Descartes had no sense data, made no observations. See me after. So, for me, this completely kicks that argument in the head. Descartes' argument for Cartesian dualism, any argument for dualism, the only other argument I've ever seen for dualism, just shrivels up and dies. It can't work. It's like trying to fly by baking. I want to fly to the moon, so I'm going to follow a souffle recipe. and I make this wonderful souffle. I got to practice a while, right? And I write, now I'm going to, and it's making me fly to the moon. Of course, it's not going to. It couldn't ever do. No matter how many souffles I make, none of them will ever make me fly. Not even a little bit. And you can't stand on them because they're souffles, so collapse under your feet. So, okay, does this make sense as an argument? Right. Any questions? All right. So that was the easy bit. Now, I've said several times that I think rationalism is dead. That rationalism is a way of doing philosophy that we don't need anymore, that can't work, and nobody should follow, and is only studying for should only study for academic interest, if you like it. Right? And certainly there are parts of rationalism that can't go on after this. There's the philosophers Leibniz and Spinoza, who Leibniz had this doctrine called the monadology. It's an ontological doctrine that says there's no such thing as causality. Everything happens by a magnificent pre-existing harmony created by God. According to Leibniz, smoking doesn't actually cause cancer. It's just God arranged everything so that cancers would happen at the same time people smoked. People take up smoking and cancer's happening, but it's a coincidence. If someone hits you up at the side of the head and you fall down because God arranged for you to fall down at that moment, and He also arranged for the guy to slap you up the side of the head at the same moment. But the one did not cause the other. Right? That's Leibniz. Spinoza, and I love the Spinoza, he said every substance is the same substance, there's no distinction between human material substance and immaterial substance, they're all substance, and there's no distinction between human substance, human soul, and God. So basically everything is God and we are all God. And it's a really cool, exciting and inspiring doctrine that's entirely based on conceptual reasoning. And so it really doesn't mean anything. It can't work, but it's pretty cool. So get a chance to study Spinoza, I recommend that, because it's fun. But it's not right. It's not going to go anywhere. Nobody's going to do that kind of argument again. Nobody built the monadology is only studied as a historical instance of philosophy. Leibniz's theory of substance is only studied as a historical thing. Nobody is building new work and look, Leibniz told us this about monads and we can add this thing to it. Right? This thing I showed you of Locke reacting to Descartes, and then Berkeley building on Locke, and Hume building on Berkeley and Locke, and this later off stage Immanuel Kant builds on Hume, and philosophy starts to fray. That doesn't happen in rationalism. It doesn't happen with those kinds of arguments, especially not with those kinds of arguments. But I'm going to argue that rationalism is not simply and exclusively conceptual reasoning. So I'm going to answer that question. No, the analytic synthetic doctrine does not by itself kill rationalism dead. No, because No, because some rationalist reasoning is synthetic. Now, the first example, an easy example, now, again, slave boy argument, pretty terrible argument, awful, awful argument. But it was an evidence-based argument. Plato did not talk about the concept of a slave boy or the concept of an educated or uneducated person. He said, look, here's this physical object, this slave boy, and he's going to do mathematics even though he thinks he can't do mathematics. But look, he did mathematics, and I didn't tell him anything. I just asked questions. All right, so terrible argument, but it was evidence-based. Because it's like you take the slave boy, have him do this thing, look, this happens. So, not purely analytic. So here, and now a more difficult example, and in this next example, I'm going to try and say something deeper about what evidence is and what it is about sense data that makes it data for empiricists and what empiricists are really saying. And why Berkeley is awesome, was awesome. The cogito. The argument that leads up to and then goes from cogito ergo sum. Je pensais donc je suis. Yeah, I practiced that. I'll get it right eventually. The cogito ergo sum. I'm arguing that there is one sense datum in that argument, that it's not all conceptual. It's a very conceptual argument because, right, Descartes says, well, I'm not gonna believe anything until I can find something that can't be doubted. I'm going to look at it, hold everything tentatively, put everything aside. I'm not going to commit to any belief. I'm not going to accept any belief or reject any belief until I find something that's undoubtedly true, and then I'm going to try and reason from that. And then he says, well, let's tentatively believe or think about the possibility of a demon deceiver, a being who can deceive us, who can fool our senses. Right? A demon who can fool our senses at any time about anything. Oh my God, what is that? Let's assume that that's there, because it shows that even the slightest doubt is enough to say we can't believe it. Let's try to see if there's anything there that the demon could not deceive us about. Something we could be perceiving, something that could be going on that we could not be wrong about. And he comes up with the cogito. If I am doubting that I am having this doubt. Well, if I doubt that I have this doubt, I'm still doubting. I can't doubt without doubting. Right? It's logically impossible. And this turns out to be a general feature of experience. There's an optical illusion where you have a big arrangement of black squares like this. Right. Have you ever seen this one? It's a big arrangement of black squares, it's bigger, right? And when you look at it, if you sort of look away from it, it gets these little, like there's a little black circle in some of them, right? But when you look where the circle is, it's not there. It's over the other side. So, you know, it'll keep me amused for hours. I look over here and the black dot's here, and I keep trying to follow it around the picture. Of course, it's not really there. It's an artifact that our eyes make. So we know there's no real physical thing there. Or we know that it disappears, right? We know that it disappears when we look there. We don't know, if we don't know for certain that the external world exists, we don't know if it's actually there or not, right? Have this little grey dot appear in the corner of our eye. But one thing we do know, and we know for certain, is that we're perceiving it. We see something there. Even if our theory of the universe says it's not really there, we perceive it. And that is our certainty. I absolutely did perceive this. So, you know, if you talk about mistaking someone for someone else, I'll sometimes mistake one student for another student, and that's embarrassing. Oh, hi, Joe. No, I'm Fred. Okay, sorry. Right? But for a second, he did look like him, right? You know, every time you've made a visual mistake, it looked the way it looked. Right? You perceived what you perceived. You experienced what you experienced. Whether the real world matches your experience is a theoretical question. So, I doubt that I'm doubting, or I have a thought, right? I have a thought. Say you have a thought that you can't wait for this lecture to end. Or you wish I would stop going like this. I don't know, waving my hands around or something. You ever thought that my hand is stupid? So you have a thought. If you have that thought and you're thinking that thought right now, is it possible that you're not having that thought? Could you be fooled about the thought that you're having? Remember Berkeley. Sense data, secondary qualities. They are things in us that we perceive. There are perceptions in us. They're not things outside of us that we perceive. That's Locke's theory to explain perceptions. Perceptions are in things in us that we are sure of. We are sure that we're seeing that little dot between the four squares. We're not sure that there's anything outside in the world providing it. And so Descartes' doubt, his perception of his own doubt, is something inside of him. And there may not be anything outside to account for it, or outside of his mind. There may be no physical body to account for it. But it's there. And so the cogito is a perception, right? The perception of one's own doubt is a perception. One thing about philosophy is that when people come into philosophy, they seem to have sort of an idea that the real world, the external world, is a matter of certainty and fact. It is just, that's basically, it's there, and the contents of my mind are just theories and ideas and things, and they're not as real. But it's actually the opposite way around. Your perceptions are real. They're the most real thing to you. They're the thing that you're the most certain of. You cannot be absolutely certain that there's anything outside providing them, causing them. It's a good theory, right? The idea that matter exists is a good theory I myself subscribe to this theory. I believe that there's a real world. It's made of matter that follows physical laws. It's made of matter as mass energy. Right? E equals mc squared is pretty close to the truth, and so on. Right? But the thing I'm most certain about, much more than that, is that I have that idea. Not that there's a reality outside. Reality is a theory. And that's one thing that's one thing a lot of people forget. Inside philosophy, reality is a theory. It's a thing we believe in to explain our impressions, our experiences, our possessions, our sense data. And the cogito ergo sum, I claim, is not a purely conceptual argument, because the argument, the actual arguing part of it, that he starts making claims about what exists and what doesn't, is I perceive myself doubting, and I can't be wrong about that. I cannot be wrong about my perceptions. I cannot be wrong about the fact that I have a concept of perfection, because I have that concept. I can think about it. And that's a sense data, really. Sense data. All right, any questions? I love questions. Please have questions. Oh. All right. So now I'm going to do the objections to the category, to the doctrine. By the way, on the final, if you call the doctrine the distinction or the distinction the doctrine, I'm not going to care. I'm going to make this distinction between the analytic-synthetic distinction and the analytic-synthetic doctrine for the lectures, but if you slip up on the terminology later, I'm not going to care, as long as you understand the concepts and the arguments. First, I'm going to give you sort of the main argument for, the starter argument for the doctrine. Right, sort of, this is how we get started thinking about it, and then when we do the objections, it's going to really sort of harden, I think the result will be to harden the argument. So, So the first thing is, I give you examples of propositions, right? And then I'm hoping that you think about other propositions you may know about, any kind of proposition you can think up or create. And you find that every proposition you could ever find, or that you think of, falls into one or the other of these categories. Neither falls into both categories. Neither falls outside the categories. An analytic synthetic proposition would be a proposition that's both. We don't find any. we don't find any non-analytic, non-synthetic propositions. No A, no S. Not A, not S cross. We only find propositions that are analytic and not synthetic, and propositions that are synthetic and not analytic. That's the first claim. That's the sort of the argument for, the basic argument for the doctrine. And so, hey, once we come up with this doctrine, and we look around and we think about propositions that we know about, we realize that every proposition fits into this category. That it sort of neatly explains differences between kinds of propositions that we've seen before. So does this make sense as an argument? Okay. What would prove this wrong? What would prove the doctrine wrong? Come up with a proposition that's both analytic and synthetic? That'd prove it wrong, because it says we don't find analytic synthetic propositions. We only find ones that are just analytic and ones that are just synthetic. Someone comes up with a proposition that's neither analytic or synthetic, that'll prove it wrong, because it says we don't find those. You know, think about Cartesian dualism. The argument against Cartesian dualism is that it conflicts with our experience. In our experience, mind and body interact. Cartesian dualism, any kind of ontological dualism, says that mind and body cannot interact. So if our experience of our lives is correct, if our beliefs about our lives are correct, dualism has to be false. It's kicked right in the head. And so the same sort of window, the same sort of thermal exhaust point exists here. The question is, can it be hit? Well, the first attempt is the causality objection. In the book, they call this the causality weakness. I don't like that term because it implies that the objection succeeds, and I actually don't think it does. So here's the causality objection. I'll put it in red because it's scary. And it can be stated as an argument against the analytic-synthetic distinction, the analytic-synthetic doctrine. As a general rule in philosophy, one of the things that would want you guys to get from this class is that in philosophy, and very much every so often in real life, it is the stuff that is taken for granted that is actually the weakest part of an argument. Stuff that is taken for granted that is the weakest part of the argument. When people discuss the idea that knowledge is justified true belief, and they talk about a belief that is justified and true, right? And they give the example, here's a belief, right? Here's a guy believes this, it's justified, and it's true. The thing they take for granted is that the belief is true. Hey, let's assume that it's true. And then when you ask, can you prove this example, prove this assumption? Can you give some support for this assumption? To make it something that is argued for, that is supported, that we have a reason to believe, rather than you just, hey, come on, you know, work with me here. You know, play along. When we refuse to play along, we refuse to accept the stuff that we're supposed to take for granted, it turns out to be wrong. Justified true knowledge cannot be justified true belief, because the only way we know that something is true is by looking at the evidence, and that's justification. So here's this argument, this objection to the Cartesian doctrine, and it starts out, causality exists is true. You guys know what causality is, roughly. Smoking causes cancer, right? We make causal claims all the time. Invading Iraq will be a good... before we invaded Iraq, I argued that it was a bad idea because it would be a great recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. And when we invaded Iraq, Osama bin Laden basically said, yay! Because that was actually his plan. So Osama bin Laden believed that bringing down the two towers would cause the United States to invade an innocent, he said innocent, Muslim country, and that would turn Muslims against the United States. And I think that's basically what happened to a certain extent. Overall, the plan failed, but there's this. So we make causal claims all the time. I easily could be wrong about that. Right? We make causal claims. Is anyone here who has any trouble with the concept of causality, of some things causing other things? No, it's just, you take it for granted, right? You know, like if you double your calorie consumption, what's going to happen to you? You're fat. If you halve your calorie not that it's actually possible to halve your calorie consumption. I mean, I can't eat less, but I've so failed to diet so many times. But if you halve your calorie consumption, what's going to happen? You get thinner or die, depending on how many calories, right? So we believe in causality. It's something we believe so much. Have you ever met someone who disbelieved in causality? Well, there are people who disbelieve in causality in like certain little areas. Oh, this won't do any harm. But generally speaking, we believe in causality with just about everything. Causality exists is not an analytic proposition. If I say causality exists, am I talking about the meanings of concepts? Right. If I try to disprove causality exists, do I make an argument based on concepts? Or is it a claim about the world? Analytic concepts are not claims about the world. When I say something exists, right, I'm making a claim about the world. I'm not making a claim about relations of ideas. So it's pretty clear that causality exists is not analytic. Now, negotiating this next bit is going to depend ultimately on deeply investigating the idea of causality, of what we're actually saying when we say causality exists, of what we're actually talking about when we talk about causality, that what it really means to say something like smoking causes cancer. So first, I'm going to give you Hume's argument against his own theory. So first I want you to, he says there's no sense datum to which we can trace the idea of a cause. He's claiming, right, that we know that this pen exists because you can see this blue patch, right, in the air, blue and white. There's the shading and little highlights and things that say, okay, you see it. And if I threw it at you and managed to hit you, you'd know it exists. You'd have a sense data of it bouncing off your skull or hitting you in the eye or something, right? Does anyone doubt that it would hurt if I managed to hit you, that you'd notice it? Anyone here think that the pen would pass straight through your head? Yeah. Right. Okay, so we have all these sense data, right? We have all this stuff. Hume says causality doesn't have sense data. We see stuff happening, but we don't see stuff causing other stuff. I'm going to try and make this clear. Right. I want you to contemplate a blue pool ball, a billiard ball, right? So there's this blue ball just sitting on the pool table. It's sitting, doesn't move, it's sitting, and then suddenly it starts to move. Moves a little further. Right. And also contemplate a red ball. Imagine this is a film, we can run back and forward. Okay. See me after, about attendance. I'm being tidy. We have this red ball. Right, these are time segments. This is like frames of a movie, right? So you can imagine this like on flashcards or a flip book. There's the red ball. It's moving, it's moving, it's moving. Oh, sorry, not fast enough. I haven't moved the other way. So you can imagine, that's not physically possible. I'm sorry, I screwed up. So you have the red ball that moves until it comes in contact with the blue ball, and then the blue ball starts moving, and the red ball slows down. It's not moving as quickly. So if you ever at a pool table and stuff, you can sort of test this. Now, what's the normal analysis of this? What do we say? We'd say that the motion of the red ball intersecting with the location of the blue ball, right? The red ball hit the blue ball and caused it to move. Now we say that, but we don't see that. Think about any pool game you've ever seen, or any kind of game where things hit other things and things hit over. Hume would say, we see things moving around and coming into contact, and then other things happening, things moving, but we don't, and we assume it's causality, but we don't see the causing. We don't see the causing. He says there is no sense datum to which we can trace the idea of a cause. Another example, imagine that I have a lot of time on my hands, that I have a huge amount of time on my hands, and I'm good with stop motion animation. Right? And I have resources, I get mannequins, and I get them and I dress them up, and I like human beings and the good wax faces and things, and animatronic stuff. And I get these mannequins, and I get a pool table and some pool balls, some cues and stuff, and I make a stop motion animation film. And imagine I'm really good at this, incredibly good at this. I wouldn't be, I'd be terrible. But imagine, play along with me that I'm really good at this, and I make a stop motion animation film that looks exactly like a real game of pool, right? The mannequins, I pose it like this, then like this, then like this, 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 like this. But I do a lot of shots, and eventually, and it works like stop motion animation, looks like the guys are playing pool. There are guys there that are playing pool. And I move the balls around, right? And say I've got a real game of pool that I film from multiple angles that I reproduce with my mannequins and my pool table. So I move the balls, right? And so here, this was actually made by stop animation. It wasn't made by filming two pool balls interacting. It was made by putting two balls like this, take a frame, take another frame, take another frame, take another. I've got to have a lot of time on my hands because it might take thousands of frames. And then run the film, and it looks like this ball hits this one and that one moves. And it looks like it. It looks exactly like it. And that's the problem. Because the red ball in my film did not cause the blue ball to move. In my film, it just looked like that. And so an experience where we see visually one thing causing another is indistinguishable from it just looking like that. So think about any instance of causality, right? Take a match and strike it on the box. And you go like this, right? You see bits of the head of the match coming off on the sandpaper, on the striking thing, the striking pad. Right? You see that, and then you see the match start to flame. But you don't see friction causing heat, causing reaction, causing combustion, causing emission of plasma. You don't see cause, cause, cause. You see it's moving along, bits are coming off, it's on fire, and you infer the cause. We don't see causality, we just assume it's there. And so Hume says, it's absolutely possible that everything is just happening. I mean, we don't see the cause part of it, right? We see things happening, but we don't see A cause it. We see A followed by B, and we don't see A causing B. Did that make sense? I think with the billiard balls, you see them moving. So we see the red ball move and then slow down radically, and we see the white ball sitting still and then moving, but we don't see the red ball making the blue ball move. And Hume thought that this was a very bad weakness in his program, and it was a weakness that Immanuel Kant, who we won't study unfortunately, tried to deal with something called a transcendental deduction. But it's the cornerstone of the argument of the causality objection to Hume's program. Right. And so Hume says it's not synthetic because it's not based on sense data. There's no sense data to which we can trace the idea of a cause. So the conclusion would be here would be Hume's, Hume's analytic synthetic doctrine is false. The idea here is that Hume's doctrine says that there's no meaningful proposition, there's certainly not a true proposition that is neither analytic nor synthetic, but we have causality exists and it's true, and it's not analytic, and it's not synthetic, so Hume's wrong. And I actually really admire Hume for this, because most people, when they confronted, most people don't even think of what could be wrong with their arguments. And when they're confronted with it, they waffle and they make stuff up, or they just keep their mouths shut. And Hume can say, look, I made this doctrine, but it's got this problem, guys. So maybe I'm wrong after all. Okay, what did I leave out? What did I not say? What is the weakness in this? How was I obfuscating here? Is it really... Now, I'm perfectly convinced that causality exists is not synthetic. It's not based on analysis of concepts at all, and it is a claim about the world. So it can't be synthetic. But is it really true that causality exists is not synthetic? Hume said there's no sense datum to which we can trace the idea of a cause. My response to that is, what about sense data? Not datum. Datum is just one. Data is plural. I once had a conversation with a fellow graduate student over at UCI, and we talked about different theories of quantum mechanics, with different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and I said, at that time I favored the Bohm interpretation, which says there's a sort of pilot wave, and he said, and the fellow I'm talking to says, but how do you explain action at a distance? And I'm like, how does that figure? What do you mean? Why would I have to explain action at a distance? All we do is assume that action at a distance happens, and we use that to explain something else. And I wasn't sure how to lead in the discussion, right? How to convey to him that I didn't think this was a problem. So I said, well, how do you explain action at contact? Because I wanted him to do is give me that explanation, and then I would use his explanation as a model for how I would try to explain action at a distance. But what he said was, well, don't be silly. You don't need to explain action at contact. Well, wait a minute. So there's one rule for your theory and another rule for my theory. I have to explain this particular element of my theory, but you don't have to explain this element of your theory? That doesn't make sense. The rules of logic are universal. If a major element of my theory needs explanation, so too does the equivalent element of your theory. So he came to, he's arguing for his theory, and this is beyond criticism. Action at contact is beyond criticism. But other people's theories, they can be criticized. They can be, and that's rubbish. So what's the analogy in here? Right? What have I not mentioned? Well, think about this. I don't believe the causality objection. I think the causality objection fails. I think it's very smart, I think it's very interesting, I think it's a great idea, and it's very useful, and it tells us stuff. We're going to learn some stuff about causality, but I think it's wrong. I don't think it knocks down Hume's. Imagine someone is here who believes in the causality objection, and imagine that person has just made the argument this way. And at this point you've got to remember, always recall, I could be misinterpreting the argument. Maybe the causality objection is better than I think it is. Maybe I've described it wrong. But just for this lecture, just for now, assume that this is how it would be phrased by someone who believes it. So imagine that someone who believes in the causality objection, and he's just given this argument, this demonstration. What question am I going to ask him? What premise am I going to investigate here? Where am I going to push? Knowing how annoying I can be.
How do you know that causality exists?
Bingo! Exactly. How do you know causality exists? He says causality exists is true. This is a true statement. I'm going to ask him, how do you know? And if he says, oh, don't be silly, we know causality exists, I'm going to say, no, you can't say that. Right? We can't take it for granted. You want this taken for granted? I'm not going to give it to you. I want to know how you know this exists. And you say, but Martin, you believe in causality, don't you? And I say, yes, I do. But I also know why I believe in causality. And I know what causality is. What causality is really at a deep level. Here's what causality is. How are causal claims proved? The first leg of any causal argument, any argument that purports to prove a causal relationship, is a correlation. Cigarettes cause cancer. Why do we think cigarettes cause cancer? Primary reason is there's a very strong correlation between being a cigarette smoker and getting lung cancer and heart disease and emphysema. But looking cool. Definitely. I'm not cool because I don't smoke. It's obviously true. Most of my problems in life, because I don't smoke. I just look at people and say, it's not smoking, it's not cool. So, right. But we know that cigarette smoking causes cancer primarily because there's a correlation. That's the first leg of it. There were virtually no cases of lung cancer before the 1940s when people started smoking. The curve for lung cancer in the United States is a sharp rise after the 40s, and then in later years it started dropping off. The cancer rate is declining. Guess what other activity has this curve? Cigarette smoking has a sharp rise after the 1940s and has been dropping since, like, I don't know, 80s or 90s, something like that. Right? People in the United States are smoking less frequently than they used to. And there's been a lot of social change. And I expect it to keep declining because of they've got these electronic cigarette things now, and people can do all the social stuff and get the nicotine fix they used to get from cigarettes through these gadget things. And you can have them in all different shapes and things. It's kind of cool. So there's the correlation. But that's not enough by itself, because it could be that something else has caused lung cancer. Maybe everybody started putting grinding up asbestos in their houses, right? Maybe a lot of people, just went in the asbestos business. Somebody sold home asbestos insulation kits, or it became a fad diet. I don't know. Let's grind up some asbestos and have dinner. Right? So you've got to eliminate the other possibilities. Well, it turns out, asbestos, not a huge thing, did not get popular, and the people who got the lung cancer, vast majority of them are smokers, cigarette smokers, without other. So you eliminate other possible causes, the correlation is still there, so you say cigarettes cause cancer. So what you're doing is, when you do that, is you're looking at all other possible correlations and eliminating those correlations as the correlation you're looking at. So when I say cigarette smoking causes cancer, I'm not making a metaphysical statement. I'm kind of making a bet. I'm making a prediction. And I'm saying that if you have a group of people, two groups of people actually, demographically identical, same diet, you know, same mix of diet, same mix of politics, same mix of socioeconomic status. And one group is composed of cigarette smokers, smoke a pack a day, let's say, or 2 packs a day, whatever the current frequency is for smoking, average. And the others, none of them smoke. I'm saying that in 30 years from now, when you look at both groups, those who are still alive in each group, any of them that have, the vast majority of those that have lung cancer will be in the group of smokers. It's very, very, very rare for a non-smoker to get lung cancer. So I'm making this prediction that the frequency of smoking will correlate with the frequency of lung cancer. It's a prediction. And that's all it is. When I say A causes B, I'm saying I'm claiming that an observed correlation between A and B in the past will continue into the future. If people continue smoking at the rate they do now, the lung cancer rate will continue at the rate it is now. If there's a change, if the vast majority of smokers switch over to artificial cigarettes, or they come up with with a tar-free tobacco, or something else like that, then there'll be a change. So smoking causes cancer is a bet about future correlations, and that's all it is. And a correlation is something we can observe. It's not a sense datum, because it's not one thing. So imagine we have 1,000 billiard tables and 1,000 different billiard balls, and each one has a white ball. And in each one, we take a red ball and we roll it so that it hits the white ball, and the white ball moves every time. That's called a correlation. If we've investigated and found that nothing else is correlated with it, like there's no earthquake at the same time, nobody tips the table at just the right moment, and finds that nothing else is correlated with it, we say that rolling one ball into another will cause the second ball to move. That's what causality is. That's something we observe, and Hume is wrong. He's wrong. It is synthetic. It is a pattern in the sense data. It's something we observe as a pattern, a repeated, reliable pattern in sense data. So the causality weakness doesn't exist. It's really not a weakness. The causality objection fails. That makes sense. So, and as Brittany said, you take this thing that's taken for granted and ask them, can they prove it? And if all they do is huff and puff and say they don't have to prove it, you can say, well, we don't need to take it as a premise. Or we can look at how it is proved. Look at why we believe this. And we believe causality exists based entirely on the evidence, and that is synthetic reasoning. So the doctrine stands up, at least to that objection. So, here's the last and strongest objection, and I call it the category objection. And I can phrase it as an argument. The analytic synthetic doctrine is itself a proposition. It's a proposition. It says something about reality. It's a claim about reality. It is in fact, right. But is it a synthetic or analytic proposition? When I described the distinction, right? When I described the distinction, did I say, here's the concept of a proposition, here's other concepts that we can compare to it, and look, from this concept, I deduce this distinction about the world? Well, first, for one thing, Hume says that's not going to work. If I'm going to say something about the world, if I'm going to say that every proposition in it is either analytic or synthetic, I can't do that based on concepts, because the doctrine says I can't. I can't prove the doctrine by an argument that the doctrine says doesn't work. There's some kind of contradiction there. I would have to be wrong if I took that kind of argument. So it cannot be an analytic proposition. So the next premise, or the next worry, is, well, doesn't seem to be, it's not synthetic either, so Hume is wrong. Now, I don't know if this objection was made in Hume's lifetime. It's certainly been made against his distinction and against something called logical positivism, which makes a similar distinction, or the same distinction. But you can probably guess I don't agree with this premise. It says the analytic-synthetic distinction is not a synthetic proposition. Right? The analytic-synthetic doctrine is not a synthetic proposition. I disagree with this. How did I argue for this? How did I explain this? I didn't start out with concepts, right? What did I do? When I said, okay, there are analytic propositions, what did I do next? Over here, in red and green ink. I gave you propositions. I gave you examples. I gave you evidence. A proposition is something that exists in the world. We encounter propositions. We don't have innate ideas. There are some things I don't know, some things I don't understand. Calculus, for instance. I can't do calculus. The Higgs boson. I've had it explained to me 3 times, and I still do not understand the Higgs boson. I mean, how it's supposed to work. It just doesn't, the explanations don't make any sense to me. And, every so often, I check BBC News, and every so often there's some new thing in the world, and I'm like, I never heard of that thing. Oh, well, okay. Something I didn't know about until a few days ago, Florida Man. There's a Twitter feed, Florida Man. Florida Man tries to asphyxiate a police dog. Florida Man, I don't know, I mean, I don't remember it, but there's Twitter feed that talks of Florida Man as though it was one person doing all these insane things that guys in Florida apparently do all the time. So, I never heard of that before, right? It's a proposition. One day, I don't know about it. The other day, I do. So, the proposition Florida Man exists, or the proposition Florida exists, the proposition something called De Morgan's law, which is a proposition which is an analytic proposition. No bachelors are married. There is a square circle. I encounter these. I remember reading fiction, and there's this thing where these kids are being tested, and one of the tests is, prove a square circle exists in 500 words. And I'm like, what the hell are they talking about? Yeah, what's a square circle? That's really weird. And then I found out, okay, square circle is an example of something that can't be true, so they're being asked to do something that cannot be done. And it's kind of weird. But I come across the proposition. So we encounter propositions, right? How many of you heard the claim, the proposition, a square circle exists, before coming into this classroom? Nobody, right? A married bachelor. Nobody's heard of a married bachelor before. These are new propositions. I mean, they're rubbish propositions. They're not propositions you're going to take home and show your family. Look what my professor gave me. A shiny new proposition that's going to be useful. It's like, no, I don't want to talk about that. But they're still propositions. Propositions are things that we encounter. We see them. We hear them. We interact with them. We know about some of them and not others. And so, in making this distinction, we go through a list of propositions and look at each proposition independently, on its own, to see whether it's analytic or synthetic, to see if it has the features that put it in one category or the other. And the argument for the proposition, the argument for the Humean doctrine of the analytic-synthetic distinction being absolute and exhaustive, the argument is hey, here's some propositions. Look, we'll look at some propositions. Now, can you come up with a proposition that doesn't fit the doctrine? Can you come up with a proposition that that contradicts the doctrine? So far, nobody has. At least not that I've heard of. If they had, Hume would be wrong. But until they do, Hume is not wrong. And in fact, I think he's right. I don't think anyone, my bet is that no one will ever come up with a proposition that doesn't fit the distinction, including the distinction itself. The doctrine is synthetic. Oops. Propositions are ideas. You can encounter an idea in your own head, like the idea of perfection, or the idea of it being impossible to doubt yourself, the idea of self-doubt, doubting that you're doubting. You encounter these. And we examine them. We encounter them, we examine them, and Hume says, look, every proposition anyone's ever come up with can be put in one pile or the other. There's no proposition that has to go in both piles, and there's no proposition that's left over that doesn't go into either. That is empirical reasoning. So it tells us something about this. Do we know the doctrine, if the doctrine is true, do we know it with certainty? No, we don't. It's not a logical tautology. You know, the analytic synthetic doctrine is not a tautology. Its negation is not a contradiction in terms. If I say a proposition exists that does not fit the analytic synthetic distinction, have I contradicted myself logically? Is that a logical self-contradiction? So it's not a logical self-contradiction, which means, again, it's a synthetic proposition. It's a proposition about what exists in the world. Propositions exist in the world. True propositions and false propositions exist in the world. But we can't know it for certain. We do not have certainty. I mean, I'm as certain of this as I am that the universe exists, but I'm not absolutely certain. Okay, any questions? Okay, so whether I'm right or wrong, all this stuff will be on the final. All right, thank you very much for your attention.